divorce finalized in January. By February, I was in a new house in a suburb outside Columbus, which is not the sentence I thought I'd be writing at 33, but there it is. 3 bedrooms, small backyard, a street where everybody parked in the garage and nobody left their trash cans out overnight. My neighbors sent a welcome card. The HOA sent a packet about garbage schedules and lawn maintenance standards. I remember thinking, this is fine. This is manageable. Something I could actually control after a year of controlling nothing. About 2 weeks after I moved in, mail started arriving addressed to a David Pruitt at my address. I didn't give it much thought at first. Forwarding delays happen, especially with accounts set up years ago that nobody ever thinks to update. I stacked the letters on the kitchen counter for a few days, then dropped them back in the outgoing mail with "Return to sender" scrawled across the front. That felt responsible enough. They kept coming. After the 3rd batch arrived, I Googled the name. It took 4 minutes. David Pruitt, 67, died 14 months ago. The obituary listed his home address as mine, so I wasn't getting mail for someone who'd moved. I was getting mail for someone who had died in this house. That sat with me for a day or two. People die in houses. It's not unusual. Accounts close, records update eventually, the mail stops. I repeated this to myself and mostly believed it. What I couldn't talk myself past was the handwriting. I'd been setting the returned letters aside in a cardboard box instead of throwing them away. Something felt wrong about tossing them, and I'd stopped examining why. One evening, I went through them more carefully. On 2 separate envelopes, there were small handwritten annotations in the margins. A date, a short phrase on one I couldn't fully make out. The handwriting was different on each, different enough that it clearly wasn't the same person. Multiple people were writing by hand to a dead man at my address, not a bulk mailing, not a form letter. People picking up pens and writing to David Pruitt. I told myself it was probably family members who hadn't been informed of his death, a church group, an old social club. I recycled the box and moved on with my week. Then an envelope arrived with no postage, no stamp, no postmark, no cancellation mark, just sitting in the mailbox. My address on the front in clean, typed letters. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside, a single sheet of white paper. Blank. No writing, no printing, nothing. Someone had hand-delivered an empty letter to my house. I stood there looking at it for a while. I had no framework for what I was supposed to do with a blank page in an unstamped envelope. I didn't have one. That weekend, I walked door to door and asked 3 neighbors if they'd known David Pruitt or noticed anyone at my mailbox recently. 2 of them said they didn't know the name. My neighbor directly across the street, a man named Ray, late 50s, always in a fleece vest, said the same. But he paused before he said it. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. I'd done IT support for 8 years by that point. I'd learned to notice the pause people take when they're deciding what to tell you instead of just telling you. Ray was deciding. I ordered a doorbell camera that night. Basic model, wide angle, motion activated, pointed at the mailbox in the front walk. I told myself if I caught someone in the act, I'd at least have something solid to bring to the post office or the police. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual showed up. Regular mail truck, a neighbor walking past, a kid on a bike, nothing at the mailbox outside normal hours. I started wondering if I'd built this up in my head. Ray's pause had been 2 seconds. That's not a confession. Then, on a Tuesday night at 11:42 p.m., the camera caught something. I was reviewing overnight footage on a Wednesday morning before work when I saw it. A figure walking up my driveway, not hurried, not trying to hide, just walking the way you walk to your own mailbox. Straight to it, opening it, sliding something inside, then turning to face the front of my house and staying there. I timed it on the playback. 11 minutes. 11 minutes of standing at the edge of my driveway facing my front door before turning and walking back to the street without looking back. I watched the clip a dozen times trying to make out the face. The angle was slightly off. The camera pointed a little too steeply toward the mailbox and caught the figure from the side more than the front. But the height, the build, the gray fleece vest, I recognized it. I was pretty sure I was looking at Ray. I spent 2 days deciding what to do with that. Part of me said to go knock on his door and show him the footage. The other part of me was aware that a man had been making late-night visits to my mailbox and standing in front of my house for 11 minutes, and that confronting him alone at his front door without any further plan wasn't necessarily smart. What I did was wait until I saw him in his driveway one afternoon and walked over. I told him I'd seen him on camera. Said it plainly, no setup. His face went white, not caught out white, scared white. He looked past me toward his own house before he answered. "I'm not the one writing the letters," he said. "I was trying to take them before you saw them." He kept his voice low. He told me that David Pruitt had been his neighbor for almost 20 years, that he'd been keeping an eye on the house since David passed, and that some of the people who'd been sending letters didn't know David was gone, that some of those people he didn't want interacting with whoever moved in. I asked him why. He said, because some of them think David is still here. I didn't ask him to explain that. I went inside and called the police. The officer who came out was professional, took a report, said she'd pass it along for extra patrol in the area. She reminded me that a neighbor walking to a mailbox wasn't a crime. She told me to call again if anything escalated. 4 days later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. No postage. Inside, a photograph, printed on copy paper, slightly pixelated like it had been enlarged from something smaller. It was a photo of the front of my house taken at night. My truck in the driveway, my living room light on. I could make out my shadow moving behind the window. Someone had been standing in the street, photographing me through my own window while I sat inside. In the lower right corner of the photo, handwritten in small, neat letters, "We can wait." I called the police again. They added it to the report. They never identified anyone. The letters stopped over the following weeks. Gradually, then completely. Nothing else happened that I could point to as concrete. I sold the house 7 months later. I didn't mention any of it to the buyers. I've thought about whether I should have. What I keep coming back to is Ray's face in that moment, the split second after I told him I'd caught him on camera. He didn't look relieved to be caught. He looked scared that I'd made contact with something he'd been trying to keep away from me, that the blank letter had been my first reply, not just a delivery. I don't know what he knew. He moved out 2 months after I did. I don't know where he went. I hope whoever's living in that house now throws away any letters addressed to David Pruitt without opening them. I want to be upfront about something before I get into this, because I know how it sounds. I'm an architect. I've been drawing and measuring spaces professionally since I was 24. I've been through hundreds of residential properties, new construction, historic renovation, everything in between. I understand how buildings work at a level most people don't. I'm telling you that so you understand why, when I tell you something was wrong with the measurements of my new house, that wasn't me being dramatic. That was me being precise. I bought the house at 28, first property I'd ever owned, a 1940s bungalow in a neighborhood outside Portland. I'd done my due diligence, pulled the original blueprints from the county assessor, hired an independent inspector, walked the property twice before closing. It was a fixer-upper in the best sense. Good bones. Just needed updating. About 3 weeks after I moved in, I started taking detailed measurements as part of planning the renovation. This is something I do automatically. I can't help it. I walk into any space and I start calculating. The numbers didn't match. I don't mean they were slightly off. I mean when I added up the square footage of every interior room, the total came out 140 square feet short of what the blueprints and the county records showed. The house was smaller on the inside than it should have been based on the exterior walls, by a significant margin. I went through my measurements twice, then a third time. Checked my tape against a laser measure I borrowed from the office. The discrepancy held at 140 square feet. Somewhere inside this house, there was a space that wasn't accessible from any room I'd mapped. The most likely explanation was a thick interior wall, something insulated beyond normal specs, maybe an addition that wasn't done cleanly. I started walking the hallways with a measuring tape in one hand and a stud finder in the other, checking wall widths against what the blueprints specified. I found it in the main hallway, a section of wall about 6 feet wide that read roughly 34 inches on the stud finder pass, nearly 3 feet thick. Interior walls in residential construction are typically 4 to 6 inches. There was no insulation, plumbing, or structural column that would require a wall nearly 3 feet thick in a hallway. Someone had built that thickness in deliberately. I knocked on it. Hollow. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Old construction sometimes has eccentricities. Double wall construction for sound dampening was a thing, especially in mid-century homes. I marked the spot on my floor plan and moved on with the week, telling myself I'd open it up when I started the renovation properly. But I kept thinking about it. On a Saturday morning, about a week later, I cut a small 2-inch inspection hole in the drywall at head height, just big enough to get a flashlight beam through. I looked in. Behind the outer drywall was another layer of drywall, painted, finished with the same textured surface as the original interior walls of the house. Not insulation, not framing, a finished wall surface. Someone had drywalled over an existing finished wall and built out from it, sealing whatever was on the other side. I expanded the inspection hole to about 8 inches. I pointed my flashlight through and moved it around. The space on the other side was narrow, about 3 feet deep, running most of the length of that hallway section. The floor was concrete. The original wall, now the back wall of the sealed space, had horizontal scratches near the bottom, low on the wall. At floor level, in the corner, there were dark stains on the concrete that I didn't look at for very long. I called a contractor friend that evening and described what I'd found. He came over the next day and we opened the wall properly. The space was 142 square feet, almost exactly the discrepancy I'd calculated. The scratches near the floor were long and ragged, the kind you get from fingernails, not tools. Horizontal, at a height someone would reach if they were lying on the floor. On the back wall, at about waist height, someone had written in marker the letters small and careful. I was here. Below that, a date, 2009. I called the police. They came out, photographed everything, took the information. They told me they'd check missing persons cases from around that period. One of the officers, before he left, asked how long I thought the space had been sealed. I said based on the construction it looked like at least 15 years, maybe more. He wrote something in his notebook and didn't share it with me. A detective called me 6 weeks later. She said they'd looked into the property history and found records of a complaint filed by a previous tenant in 2007, a woman who reported that her roommate had disappeared from that address. The case was never closed. They'd found no connection to the sealed space at the time because it had already been built over. They don't know who built the wall. The owner of record during that period had sold the property and moved out of state. I moved out of that house in the same month the detective called. I couldn't finish the renovation. I couldn't go into that hallway without looking at the wall I'd opened, at the scratch marks near the floor that I knew would stay in my head whether I looked at them or not. The last thing I measured before I left was the depth of the sealed space one more time. 142 square feet, exactly. The blueprints and county records listed the house as 142 square feet larger than the interior I'd mapped. Someone had measured carefully before they built that wall. I bought my house at a county foreclosure auction. Didn't get to do a walkthrough first, just a drive-by and whatever you could pull from public records. I knew what I was getting into, or I thought I did. I'd been to a handful of these auctions before, never won anything. This time I put in a number I figured was too low, and they took it. The place needed work, but nothing structural. New floors in 2 bedrooms, kitchen needed updating. 1 bathroom had water damage from an old leak that had already been repaired. For what I paid, it was a solid deal. I was 31, worked warehouse logistics, and I wasn't afraid of spending my weekends fixing things. I moved in with a truck and 2 guys from work helping me carry furniture, and by that evening I was sitting on a folding chair eating pizza in my new living room. The attic pull-down stairs in the 2nd floor hallway were rusted shut. I noticed it the first week but didn't give it much thought. I didn't have a reason to go up there. I made a note to deal with it eventually and moved on. About 2 months in, I started hearing something from the ceiling above my bedroom at night. Not the house settling. I know what settling sounds like. The random pop of wood contracting. This was different. A sequence of sounds. 4 or 5 in a row, spaced unevenly, then nothing. Then again, maybe 20 minutes later, I told myself it was the HVAC. Old house, ductwork runs through the ceiling, temperature changes cause expansion and contraction. This was the explanation I repeated to myself for about a week, until the sounds got specific enough that I couldn't hold on to it anymore. One night around 1:30, I lay there and listened to the sequence move. Not at random, from one side of the ceiling to the other. It stopped when I turned the lights on. It started again about 10 minutes after I turned them off. I spent most of the next morning in the hardware store and came home with a crowbar and some WD-40. I worked the attic stairs open for the first time. They dropped down into the hallway, trailing rust and old insulation dust. I pointed my flashlight up into the opening. The attic was mostly what I expected. Low headroom, exposed joists, fiberglass insulation bats between them. A few old cardboard boxes that had been left by whoever lived there before. The only thing I could walk on without putting a foot through the ceiling was the joists themselves, so I stepped carefully, working my way across. What I found was in the far section above my bedroom. In the insulation dust that had settled between the joists, there were footprints, adult-sized bare feet, a track running from the attic hatch to a specific point above the bedroom and back to the hatch. The path had been walked enough times that the dust was compressed, not disturbed. This wasn't someone who'd been up here once. This was a pattern. At the point the footprints led to, the spot directly above my bed, someone had cleared away a small area of insulation between two joists and scratched at the drywall below until a small hole had opened through it, maybe the size of a quarter. I got down on my hands and knees and looked through it. I could see my bedroom, the bed, the nightstand, the phone charger on the right side. I sat back on my heels and stayed like that for probably 2 minutes. I went back downstairs and stood in my kitchen, thinking through what I was going to do. I wanted a rational explanation, and I was out of them. The foreclosure auction, the sealed attic stairs, I'd assumed no one had been up there because no one had any reason to be. I'd assumed wrong. That afternoon, I put a hasp and combination padlock on the pull-down stairs, heavy duty, the kind you use for a storage unit. The next morning, the padlock was open. The shackle was hanging loose. I hadn't left it open. I was the only person with the combination. I called the county bank that had held the foreclosure. It took 3 calls to get to someone who could actually look up the property's history. When I asked about the previous owner, a name I'd seen on a few pieces of old mail, the woman on the phone went quiet for a moment before she said, "Sir, that property wasn't foreclosed because of missed payments. The previous occupant was involuntarily committed. He was removed from the property by court order." Another pause. The reason for the commitment, I probably shouldn't tell you the details, but he was found to have been living inside the wall cavity of a neighbor's house. The neighbor didn't know for several months. I thanked her and sat down. The police came out that afternoon, looked at the attic, took photographs, and interviewed me for about 45 minutes. They found no one on the property. They noted the padlock and the footprints in their report. They told me to call if anything else happened. I moved out 6 weeks later, sold the property at a loss. I've never gone to another foreclosure auction. The thing I haven't told anyone is that when I went back up in the attic to show the police, I looked at the footprint path more carefully. The path didn't just go from the hatch to the spot above my bed and back. On several nights, you could tell by the layer of dust that had resettled between visits, the path had gone to a second spot as well, above the bathroom. The police noted it. They didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. I moved into my rental house in March, about 4 months after separating from my husband. I'd spent 12 years as a nurse on night shifts, and the one thing I knew how to do well was function on limited sleep in uncomfortable situations. I told myself a house by myself would be fine. It would be better than fine. I needed the quiet. The house was a standard 3-bedroom in a suburb about 40 minutes outside Chicago. Nice street, friendly landlord, attached garage. The only thing I did before I unpacked a single box was order a home security camera system, Ring cameras for the front and back door, and one interior camera I set up on a shelf in the living room, angled toward the main entry points. After 12 years of working nights in understaffed hospitals, I'd earned the right to feel safe where I slept. For the first 3 weeks, nothing. I reviewed the footage occasionally, mostly checking in on my cat Piper while I was at work. She spent most of her days asleep on the couch. The first thing I noticed was the timestamp. I was scrolling through the previous night's living room footage on my lunch break when I saw it. The timestamp showed continuous recording from 10 p.m. until the camera registered my morning alarm at 6 a.m. But between 2:13 and 3:01 a.m., the footage showed a static image. The camera was still running according to the log. The motion sensor hadn't triggered. The timestamp was advancing, but the image wasn't changing. 48 minutes of a frozen frame showing my empty living room. I called Ring customer support. They walked me through a diagnostic. The camera had recorded continuously with no interruption on their end. No connectivity drop, no power fluctuation. The footage was there, but those 48 minutes showed nothing but a still image. I checked the footage from the front and back door cameras for the same window. Both showed normal expected stillness, nobody approaching the house, nothing. I told myself it was a camera glitch, a firmware issue. I updated the software and forgot about it for a few days. Then I went back and checked the previous week's footage. The gap was there every night, always between 2 and 3 a.m., always between 40 and 55 minutes of frozen frame, always the same image, my empty living room from the same camera. And in every one of those frozen frames, the couch was empty. Piper, who slept on that couch every night, was not in a single one of them. I sat with that for a long time. A cat that is consistently absent from a specific 40-minute window every night is a cat that is somewhere else. Piper was not choosing to leave the couch during a daily, random 40-minute window. Something was happening during those windows that she was reacting to. I decided to stay up. I sat in my bedroom with the door barely cracked, watching the live feed on my phone. At 2:19 a.m., the feed from the living room went still. The timestamp kept advancing. I looked at the still image for maybe 30 seconds, and then I heard something from downstairs. Not loud, a soft step on the hardwood near the kitchen. I did not go downstairs. I want to be clear about that. I'm a nurse. I've handled emergencies without panicking. I've kept my head in situations that would break most people. I lay on that bed with my phone in my hand and I did not move because I was alone in the house and the living room camera had just frozen and someone was in my kitchen. And going down there wasn't something I was going to do by myself. I called 911. By the time officers arrived, the house was empty. They searched every room, including the basement. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. They suggested a wildlife issue. Raccoon in the walls, something getting into the kitchen through a gap somewhere. They said to call the landlord. I called the landlord. He came out, checked the crawl space and the basement perimeter. Nothing. What I did next was go to the electronics store and buy an old smartphone. I installed a third-party recording app on it, set it up propped behind some books on the living room shelf, angled to cover the same area as the Ring camera, but recording independently to local storage. No cloud, no connectivity to the same network. A second set of eyes. I waited 4 days. When I pulled the phone and reviewed the footage, I found the window, 2:27 a.m. The Ring camera on the same shelf had frozen at 2:24, just like every other night. The phone camera hadn't frozen. I watched the footage with the lights on and Piper in my lap. A figure came in through the kitchen, moving through the living room, unhurried the way you move through a space you know. Opening the mail on the side table and going through it. Opening a kitchen drawer and closing it. Standing in front of the door to my bedroom hallway for 3 minutes and 20 seconds without moving. Then walking back through the kitchen and leaving through the back door. I paused the footage on the figure at the back door and looked at what was in their hand. My spare house key, the one I kept in the kitchen drawer. I called my landlord and told him I needed the locks changed immediately and that I needed to know exactly how many key sets existed for this property. He told me there were 3 sets, mine, his, and one that had belonged to the previous tenant, a man named Derek, who had moved out 8 months before I moved in. He said he'd asked Derek for the key at move out and Derek had said he'd lost it. I asked if Derek had been given a forwarding address. He hadn't. I left that house the following weekend. I'm in an apartment now. With a deadbolt, I changed myself on the day I moved in. What I go back to sometimes is the question of the camera. The Ring camera didn't malfunction. The footage log showed uninterrupted recording. Someone had figured out how to loop the feed to replace live footage with a still image for a specific window every night. That's not something a casual trespasser does. That's something that takes time and knowledge and a reason. I don't know how long Derek had been doing it before I moved in. I don't know what he was looking for. I don't know if he found it. The landlord told me, when I finally told him the full story, that the previous tenant before Derek had also moved out suddenly after only a few months in the house. He said she'd had a Ring doorbell camera too. He said she'd mentioned something about a camera malfunction before she left, but he'd assumed it was just the Wi-Fi. I work from home, which means I notice things other people on my street probably don't. I'm at my desk from around 8 until 5, in a home office with a window that faces the side yard and beyond the fence, my neighbor's property to the right. I notice when the mail comes. I notice which neighbors keep weird hours. I'm not trying to be nosy, it's just the nature of working in a room with a window. You see things. I moved into the house about 8 months ago. I'm 29, freelance graphic design, bought the place with some help from my parents as a down payment. Small 2-story in a suburb outside Minneapolis, quiet block, good schools if I ever need them. The neighbor to my right, a man named Gerald, introduced himself the first week and seemed normal enough. Early 60s maybe, retired or close to it. Always outside doing yard work or tinkering in the garage. Always waved when he saw me. His dog was large, some kind of shepherd mix, tan and black, maybe 3 years old. I noticed within the first couple of weeks that the dog's behavior was off. Not skittish off, not poorly trained off. The kind of off that takes a minute to name, because what you're watching doesn't fit any category you expect. Every time Gerald came outside, the dog went flat. Not cowering behind something, just lowering itself to the ground, ears back, making no sound. Not moving until Gerald went back inside. I'd watched enough dogs over my life to know the difference between a dog that was poorly socialized and a dog that had learned to make itself as invisible as possible around a specific person. I noticed it, filed it away, and didn't do anything with it. In my 3rd week, I was at my desk around 10:30 at night when I saw Gerald's garage side door open and the light come on. I wasn't watching deliberately. I glanced up at a movement. Gerald was carrying something from the garage toward the detached shed at the back of his property. He was struggling with it. The object was wrapped in a blue tarp, bundled and tied, and the shape was long and uneven, wider at one end, narrowing toward the other. He got it to the shed, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and maneuvered it inside. The shape bothered me. I sat at my desk for a few minutes trying to decide whether I was being paranoid. People move things in tarps all the time, yard equipment, lumber, bags of mulch. The shape had been wrong for any of those things, but I couldn't prove that from a window at night. I told myself I was reading too much into a neighbor moving something to a shed and went back to work. I started paying more attention after that, whether I wanted to or not. Gerald made trips to the shed at irregular hours over the next few weeks, occasionally late at night, occasionally early morning before most of the street was up, sometimes carrying things in, sometimes out. The shed had acquired a padlock, new, heavy-duty, clearly purchased recently out of place on the aging wooden structure. At some point, the shed's original window had been covered from the inside. The dog watched every trip from wherever it had positioned itself in the yard. Always flat, always silent. Never looked away from Gerald until Gerald was back inside. About 5 weeks after I'd first noticed the tarp, I was sitting on my front steps on a Sunday morning when Gerald's dog came around the corner of the house and sat down about 10 feet from me. It had dug under the chain link between our properties. It looked at me, then looked back at Gerald's house, then back at me. I went inside and called Gerald. He came out and collected the dog without much to say about it, but I got a look at his forearms when he reached over his fence to take the leash from me. Scratches, healed over but clearly recent. The kind you get from something with fingernails rather than something with teeth. And standing that close to him, I could smell bleach. Not like he'd been cleaning nearby, like he'd washed himself with it. He took the dog back without making eye contact and went inside. A week after that, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. for no clear reason and lay in bed with the window cracked, the way I usually do. Gerald's shed light was on. I could see the orange glow along the gap where the door frame met the door. Not a floodlight, something internal. I watched it for a few minutes. Then I saw the shadows. Through the gap in the door frame, I could make out the movement of 2 silhouettes cast by whatever light source was inside. Gerald's, I recognized the build, and a second one. The second silhouette was upright but not moving. Not sitting, not shifting, just standing there. For the amount of time I watched, maybe 5 minutes, the second silhouette didn't move at all. Gerald's dog got out again 2 days later. This time, I was in the backyard when it came through the gap under the fence. It was carrying something in its mouth. I thought it was a stick at first. It wasn't a stick, it was a bone. I'm not a forensics expert, I didn't handle it, but I've taken enough anatomy-adjacent courses in college to know roughly what a human hand bone looks like compared to an animal bone. It was the right size, the right shape, clean, the way bones get when they've been processed. I called the police. Gerald was in his backyard when they arrived. He waved when the cruisers pulled up. He was still waving, that same neighborly wave, as the officers got out and walked toward his property. He kept waving through the whole initial conversation. One of the officers told me afterward that they'd found nothing in the shed. Some yard equipment, fertilizer bags, an old chest freezer that Gerald had already opened for them. No smell, no evidence, nothing that gave them grounds for a warrant beyond a dog with a bone that a neighbor couldn't identify. The officers said the bone I'd found was most likely from an animal, that deer bones were common in the area. They left. Gerald waved at me from his yard. I haven't been able to sleep with my window open since. I put in a request to break my lease on the grounds of harassment. My landlord is currently reviewing it. I've been keeping a log of every odd hour's trip to the shed with timestamps and photographs from my window. The dog is still there. It watches Gerald's back door every evening from the far corner of the yard. It hasn't tried to come back to my property since the last time. I don't know what was in that shed. I don't know what the second silhouette was. I don't know if the detectives working this neighborhood know anything more than what that first officer told me. What I do know is that the dog isn't wrong. It's the only one in that yard paying close enough attention to know exactly what Gerald is. If any of those stories made you glance at a wall in your house a little differently, or made you wonder how many keys actually exist for your front door, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss the next scare, and drop a comment telling me which story would have made you move out the fastest. The mail, the measurements, the attic, the cameras, or the dog. I want to know. And if new houses scare you, wait until you hear what happens when people leave their houses behind and go sleep in a tent in the middle of the woods. Click now to watch 4 disturbing camping horror stories, because at least in a house, you can lock the door. Out there, the only thing between you and whatever's watching is a zipper. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.